right, good evening everyone and welcome to Brookline Booksmith's Author Events Series. My name is Alex Schaffner. I'm Events Director here at the store, and I'm very excited to introduce author Paris A. Spies-Gans and Joseph Leo Koerner discussing Paris's work, A Revolution on Canvas. On behalf of our store, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who is here tonight for supporting a local author and academic, for supporting your local independent bookstore. We've been open since 1961, and it's thanks to readers like you. We appreciate you so much for being part of our community. I'd like to thank Joseph Koerner for moderating tonight's discussion. Joseph is an art historian teaching at Harvard, whose area of study is expansive and pertinent. He studies and teaches the art of Middle Ages to the present day, with an emphasis on Northern Renaissance art, as well as Dutch 17th century art, German and English Romanticism, and Viennese modernism. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this conversation. Now it's my delight to introduce tonight's author, Paris Amanda Spies-Gans, who has written A Revolution on Canvas. Paris is a historian of art, with a focus on women, gender, and the politics of artistic expression. She holds a PhD and MA in history from Princeton University, an MA in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and an AB in history and literature from Harvard University. Tonight we celebrate her first book. When I was presented with A Revolution on Canvas and its author, I received them with a great deal of personal excitement. Once upon a time, I mean like 11 years ago, I dabbled in academia, and my dissertation was on English women writers of the 18th century. And I had spent the last 11 years looking for somebody who would like to talk about that. But as it turns out, the crowd is compact. Not so tonight. So I was thrilled to meet this book, and art speaks to art. So while my own research was on the written word, the world of the blue stocking and the cultural positions of women creatives in that time is very familiar territory, and it's something that it pleases me immensely to bring to our author series. As one person who thrills at this era, I am thrilled to find such a careful and exuberant historian among our neighbors. The 18th century is a period of time that I think Americans love to revel in the local sense, in the political sense, but it often gets skipped over culturally. This is to our detriment. There was so much energy to the long 18th century, filled with extravagance and effusiveness hedged against manners and propriety, when wit and sentiment battled full tilt. It's fascinating to delve into the arts of women in this era, a period of lavish public displays of self, which I would say is not that different from now, and limited women's rights. As the most popular tracts of proto-feminism came into publication, women artists were sometimes commercial successes, sometimes sequestered into private accomplishment, but always seeking to strike the challenging balance between what they were permitted and what they were capable of. Paris Spies-Gans' work demonstrates eager and holistic scholarship, placing her artists within their political, commercial, and creative contexts. This is a beautifully compiled book, a pleasure to read and look at, and I'm so glad that we can share the evening with the author. Please welcome Paris A. Spies-Gans.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. I've seen this book in its various forms of drafts and so forth, and it really is a revolution about canvas. Your book, it's going to change the way people understand history of painting, and also the representation of identities right now, which is so important to think about, that haven't been represented, and how they relate to the museum and public institutions and public spaces. So congratulations for writing an amazing book, beautifully produced, not yet signed, but will be. So I want to kind of roll back maybe the film to when you are a graduate student working in the field of history, and you have stretching out before you different topics that you might write your dissertation on, and you're writing perhaps a seminar paper, or when was the moment you said, this is my topic? What was it that made that eureka experience for you?
First of all, thank you so much, Joseph, for moderating this, and Alex for an incredibly nice introduction, and everyone for coming. I'm really happy to be here and really delighted you're all here too. And I mean, you brought up the key context, which is that I was in history department actually. And so as a graduate student, I got really interested in the debates around gender and the French Revolution. And it's this paradox where democracy was born and constitutions were written, and women were written out of those constitutions at the same time. And so feminists and other scholars have this ongoing debate about how good can we say it was for women who gained some rights and lost others, and how can we find different ways that women took advantage of those rights, even if they really didn't gain the political ones that we all know are so key and that they're still fighting for today. And artists weren't really part of that conversation. And every time I looked into anything that had to do with artists, it still talked about how the revolution was a paradox, but it was different because it said there were these women who had gained a huge, very high status in the years before the revolution, and Marie Antoinette was their patron. Women like Brigitte Lebrun, Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, these women who are really labeled as exceptional for what they had and what they achieved, and the idea is that the revolution dethroned them. It was worse for them thereafter, even though the French Salon, which was the most prestigious exhibition, opened to artists who weren't academicians for the first time, which means it was open to any woman, any man, anyone who wanted to exhibit their art, regardless of status. And so there was this acknowledgement that all these women started exhibiting their art, but the revolution was still bad for them. And I was reading that and just thought, why is it always bad for women? Isn't there a way that we can kind of give them a little agency, even in a world in which there were a ton of obstacles? And can we acknowledge both those things? And so I started looking to exhibition catalogs to see what there was. For France, I knew there would be a lot because I was part of the narrative, but then when I was in England at the Royal Academy looking at their exhibition catalogs, that's when it was really the aha moment. It's kind of when I switched from pencil and paper to a computer to start writing the names, and then just started taking pictures and scanning it all because there were so many women, and that wasn't part of any narrative. And it turns out there were way more women exhibiting in England than in France, about 800 to 400 in the years I studied. I just knew there was something there that hadn't been discussed, and whatever, even if their art didn't survive, which it turns out it does, and even if they didn't do all the things we traditionally celebrated in art, which it turns out they actually did, there was, at the very least, a numbers argument, and then it became a lot more.
Yeah. And you think, I mean, just as you're speaking, you think about that art in the thinking about the French Revolution with people like Tom Crow, there was often a sense that the art in the public sphere was not just a reflection of historical events leading up to the French Revolution, but was actually instrumental in creating a public space, and therefore going to see actually obliquely then what the story of women are within this concept of public life. I can see. But you must have been, so let me just read one of the most amazing early sentences which you come back to. Between 1760 and 1830, more than 1,300 women showed more than 7,000 works of art in the most eminent exhibitions held in London and Paris, regularly contributing 7 to 12% of the pieces on display. I'm going to hold off your follow-up on that because it's remarkable, but I just want to sit on those numbers. Archival work must have been part of getting 1,700, and I wondered, when did you see that the archive, and when you turned to your computer, when did you see that numbers are going to be an important part and data in your work?
Yeah, I saw the importance of numbers a few months into my first research trip. It was in the Royal Academy Library. I had a friend I had actually met her that day. We're still friends. She read parts of this book and commented on it. And it was in the 1790s when I was looking at what was happening in the 1790s in these exhibition catalogs. And what was interesting to me about that is it was post the French Revolution, and it's when all of these new conversations are happening about women and gender roles, and we don't talk about those in England as much as we do for France, but it's when Mary Wollstonecraft, who's British, is writing. It's when there's all these new efforts to get, you know, public women back in the home and criticisms of women in their public activity, and yet there were all of these women who I had never heard of, and partially who I couldn't identify. It was a Miss Smith, and then there was a Miss J. Smith, and then there was a Miss M. Smith, and with no address, or even with an address, there's very few ways to access who they actually were. And if a Miss Smith exhibited a portrait of a lady, even if we find a portrait of a lady and it's signed something Smith, there's no way to know that's the one that was exhibited. And it was really thinking through what I could do with the information that was provided in these catalogs that survived, that data, I realized data would probably be important, but I also just lost track of the numbers in my head at that point. And whereas before I could say, oh, there were 6 women exhibiting 20 works and this and that, once I was in the 1790s, I just couldn't even see what was happening. And that's when I started charting it. It was just for myself. And I learned a lot from it, and that's how it ended up in the dissertation and then the book, because it was actually the only way I could understand what was happening, because the numbers were getting so high, so continually high. And then once there were graphs, in partial help of a friend who's here, I, started applying that lens to other parts, like what genres were they exhibiting. And that revealed a lot too, because as you said, there's 7,000 paintings. I can't keep it straight in my head which ones are narrative, which ones are history, which ones are miniature, which are portrait. I can't do that very well, at least. I can think I am and not trust myself. And so charts, really showed me what was going on there, and then also helped with a project that's about, a very dismissed group of artists in art history and history. It helped prove that there was something there in a way, because people could argue about whether something is great or whether, a woman should be studied, or what do you do if you can't find much to do with this individual. But people, in my experience, had a really hard time arguing against charts. And it really surprised them.
Right.
Yeah, and
So I think you early on mentioned Linda Nochlin, the pioneering, as you put it, foundational text from the early 70s, Why Are There No Great Women Artists, which you wrote a response of, why do we think that there are no great women artists? When you started to work on this material, was there disbelief? In other words, how strong was Nauchlin's hold on the picture of the past?
in my experience, Nauchlin's hold was near complete, and it kind of still is, at least for this period, because what she said essentially is that women couldn't attain greatness as artists because they lacked the tools to attain greatness, because they weren't allowed into art educational spaces that were the most important in their countries until the late 19th century. And so among different sociocultural obstacles, education was a really key one, and this meant that they couldn't access the study of the nude figure, which meant they couldn't produce history paintings, which were paintings of the highest genre, thus they could never be great artists. And I loved and still love that article. It's an incredible article. And one of the first things I started hearing when I was presenting this information from art historians was, oh, so maybe Linda Nochlin was wrong. And I thought, oh, no, she's not wrong. It's just, there's more there, or whatever it may be. And I still don't think she was wrong, because she was identifying really, really important structures that did exist, and, and their ramifications are felt to this day. But I think that what I found is it can really be updated, among other things. And it really surprised me that a lot of things I were finding just went against her argument. And what that made me think is that she also kind of suffered from a moment she identifies herself of when women are kind of written out of historical narratives, which is the late 19th century. And I think she just went along with that a little too much, because partially, at least, you know, kind of, I was just saying this, I think you need the data at a certain point to really make a challenge to an argument that's so deeply about structural inequalities that were certainly there.
Right. Well, I can report that we teach for freshmen, incoming freshmen, in considerable numbers, about 90 per year, sort of general history of art, and your article and Linda Naughlin's are paired, and everybody reads them, and everybody discusses it, and of course the issue of greatness inevitably comes up, and I'm going to leave that away. But one thing I will ask you about, especially since one has it on the back, sort of, there seems to me a paradox that on one hand, as you point out, and it's an old story, genius tends to be associated with male creativity, freedom, autonomy, all those things that go along with the idea of genius, and then you modulate that and show the degree to which genius was applied to women. But one of the most telling aspects, say, of the period you're studying for painting prior to your representation of it, was self-portraiture. Self-portraiture as a kind of demonstration of the singularity of the artist, demonstration of the artist as unique, as distinctive, and as somehow not only unique, but uniquely embodied in the uniqueness of the work that you're looking at as self-portrait. And that genre, if you did a history, if it were to be called, business as usual on canvas, and you would have male artists, you wouldn't have as many self-portraits. So what is it about self-portraits that are, it's not just an accident that self-portraiture is not only exemplary for us to think about this material, but it seems expressive in a particular way. And I wonder if you've reflected on why, I didn't count them, unfortunately I didn't do a statistical analysis, but I would have thought that quite a large proportion of the images are self-portraits.
Yeah, it's a great question. Self-portraits are really important in this book, mainly because, from my point of view, of the messages that the artist is choosing to send with them. And in France, women started exhibiting self-portraits in pretty considerable numbers after 1790, and oftentimes it's associated with their first time exhibiting in public. The painting on the back, which was exhibited at a venue before the Louvre Salon opened, this place called Exposition de la Jeunesse in, I think, 1786. It shows this woman is Marie Benoit, and she's a student of Jacques Louis David, who the book that Joseph mentioned by Tom Crow, or another book by Tom Crow, really says that David's studio, which was the premier studio of the time, existed on homosocial bonds. There's no women who were part of it, but he actually trained more than 20 women who exhibited their art. He trained this woman who you can't really see, but this is a 14-foot across history painting that she made, and he trained this woman who became, Napoleon became a huge patron of her work. And here in this early self-portrait, she shows herself painting one of David's most celebrated history paintings. She also shows her dress kind of coming off her shoulder. She's showing herself as a portraitist, which means that she's a commercial artist, but she's showing herself implicitly as able to produce historical scenes. And why I think self-portraiture is so important is because what these women are doing in the self-portraits that survive is showing that they can do a lot more than paint portraits, in fact. Another David student, there's a drawing in this book that she exhibited at her debut in 1793, and it shows her drawing a new figure. And so the other ways that one combats really important narratives like Naughtlin is, in addition to data, coming up with the archive, the visual evidence. And actually we know a lot of women produced figure studies that depicted nude men and women, and those are in the book too. And for a woman to make her salon debut showing a woman artist, probably a self-portrait, drawing a new figure, it announces herself as a student of the leading painter, but also her ability, her access to this training that she's not supposed to have theoretically, and her ability to produce, again, these works of the highest genre that are the greatest works in our consideration. Another painting is, there's a great painting, and also 1793, of a woman who, it's her only time exhibiting, and she shows herself at an easel and with her baby in the background. And she's going between them, and I think I have it here. You can't really see it, but I can show people later. And it's called The Author at Her Occupations. And at this time when women's roles, men's roles, the role of the citizen are being debated and really contemplated in a completely new way for the first time, women are part of that. And that's part of why I think self-portraiture is so important at this time, because in addition to introducing themselves as artists, they're introducing themselves as citizens. And she's certainly showing that she can do both. There's all this rhetoric of motherhood. There's rhetoric about pretty much anything you would think there would be to keep women in the home, but also create kind of engaged citizen base around these concepts of revolution, democracy, all the new ideals that the revolution is bringing to Paris. And women were part of that. And they kept being part of it. Even when legislation kept them out of public spaces, they were still exhibiting in new numbers at the Salon. Even when Napoleon was restricting their presence or their ability to publish, and even when a woman's father or husband owned her works implicitly, she was putting her address in catalogs, exhibition catalogs, and selling works. And so I think the self-portraits are really emblematic of all of the ways women are playing with identities, but also broadcasting their ability to play with those identities, and their ability to, in my argument, be professionals in this context of their world.
And yeah, the play is interesting. There's so many extremely boring self-portraits in the early 19th century. And it's true that the tendency just to, here's a self-portrait, now I'm done. Which is the sort of, not the ones one remembers, but the thousands that exist in the basements of museums. And then they go on to paint history paintings. The self-portrait. Also to show, self-portraits from a very early phase was an easy way to show you can do a likeness. It's sort of like when you see street artists and they do a portrait of Bob Dylan and Jack Nicholson. Well, they say, oh, I can draw, so I will draw you. So self-portraits is a good way of showing a likeness, but they tend to be boring. Whereas the self-portraits that emerged because presumably of that surplus, that storytelling, and the story that is told is so much more interesting than the self-portrait. You have to dig very deep to find interesting self-portraits of male artists, whereas this is a much, much more interesting self-portrait. So I want to talk a little bit along those lines about, maybe it's a sort of a question of historical temperament. You write about James Boswell, the great diarist who always reflects and mirrors back the words of his much admired friend Samuel Johnson. And he reports that Samuel Johnson says the following about women painting men. Public practice of any art, writes Samuel Johnson, and staring in men's faces is very indelicate in a female. So a woman should be staring at men because it's indelicate. And one kind of art historian, myself included, would be, oh, how interesting. It's about the gaze, it's about nude, and then the nude, women aren't allowed to look at the nude, and we'll go open our John Berger and think about the different views. And you say, this was very common concern. But then you go on to say, as was so often the case, rhetoric and practice were not one and the same. That is, when you actually dig into what people do, think, and how they behave, all of a sudden a different story emerges. And I wonder about how what you think about that relationship between It's not just the story that, say, Linda Nochlin gives us, but it's also what material we use to write the story.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. The idea that rhetoric and practice don't always line up is one of the theses of the book. That when we look at what was said and what was allowed, we get one story, and that's one in which women really couldn't do much. And when you look at what they did, it's a really different story. And the positive one isn't to deny the restrictions at all, but it is to shift around the ways in which we can see them making meaning of their lives and making lives. And so, and I do think it reflects a broader practice, which is unfortunately really reflected in Nochlin, in that she kind of said women couldn't be great artists, and we still think 50 years later that women couldn't be great artists. And I don't know of many other narratives and theses that survived for that long in such pure form.
Yes.
And it's partially because it was a call to arms, and it led to actually a huge number of scholars finding a huge number of women artists and really digging them up and making them be part of narratives. But it still remains, and she's still the cornerstone of anything that's written about women, especially pre-contemporary. And I think what it shows is, when you look into past places, it's messy. It's always going to be messy. It's complex, and it should be. If it's clean, there's probably something you're not seeing of any place. And I think it's very easy to have these clean narratives about women that are very feminist narratives, because it's about all the work that had to be done to gain the version of equality they have today, which I think a lot of people feel strongly is still a very working version. And making it be a positive progression from, let's say, the revolutionary era, when there's this pretty big stark contrast of both rights women and men get, to the present is very appealing and very easy, and also fits really well with a lot of written records and rule books. It's a lot harder when, and I know this is a statistic we talk about, women were more present in their exhibitions then than they are in museums today. What do we do with that? The statistic Joseph quoted earlier, they averaged 7 to 12%. They got up to 16% of the works on display in France. And in most museums today, they're less than 5% of works and holdings are on the walls. You can go through many museums and not go through room after room, and there's no women. And so what does it actually say for us that women were more present then in these public spaces, in terms of what was presented as who can be an artist, let's say, than they are now? And I think it says a lot of things about our establishment today, of course, and institutions, and more than I could get into, but it makes it hard. It complicates the ways that we can engage with the story of women in history, and the ways they have and haven't been able to navigate barriers and also completely avoid certain rules. And the problem is that unless you have a lot of evidence of ways that people evaded rules, you can assume that the rules stood. And after Nochlin, I think people didn't really look for that evidence, because the narrative was A, really appealing, and B, seemed very, very trustworthy.
So, yeah, when you go on with the Samuel Johnson material, as you find that he has a great friendship with the painter with Reynolds' sister.
Yeah.
And so he pontificates, but then he turns around and has himself painted and doesn't really think what he says. So on one hand, your work has to do with interpersonal relationships, family relationships, mother-daughter relationships, father-daughter, and then there are the paintings. And this is a kind of, I suppose, oblique question I wasn't going to ask, but it's always troubled me that is one of the problems the fact that it's very hard for anybody these days to look at any early 19th century history painting, and unless they are incredibly famous people don't want to look at them. It's just it's too sentimental. There's just too much going on. It's a hard sell, no matter. I mean, maybe David, but it's only because everybody knows you're supposed to look at it. I don't think if you're, if you ask the general public, do I want to see the Oath of the Hirati? I don't think they would say yes. I would say they would like to see, surrealism but
Yeah.
not. So is that a problem that that where there's this exceptional excelling, which is so surprising, massive paintings like everybody was hoping to do, all on display, themselves need to be argued for today because of because of our tastes, and presumably also because I would have thought Linda Nachman's modernist tastes.
Yes.
She's not looking for that kind of art.
I think that's absolutely right. She even says in her article that, we can find a handful of women that be taught, but what does that really say? And, or, one could keep, finding lost David students. Yeah, I went to the MFA before COVID with a friend, who's not an art historian, and he kept saying, so going through the rooms and looking at any painting on the wall, saying, so why is this great? So why is this great? So why is this great? And I mean, I think the concept of greatness is both helpful and very problematic, obviously, but also it's period specific, in my opinion. We can have our vision of what we consider great, and a lot of it is informed by, this idea of a canon, and David is at the top of it and all of that, but I have found that it takes a while to access some of this art. You can see the story it's telling. I think portraits are much more accessible,
Yes, very
and
much so.
especially these women's portraits, which are so full of information, people really like to look at much more than the other works. And the way that I usually deal with that is by not even saying that this should be considered great or this should be in the canon, but let's look at the period and see what was valued then. And if it was valued then, we should really be teaching it if we're being historically accurate.
Mhm.
And I see it as a matter of historical responsibility rather than getting into the greatness shuffle, which, has its own very gendered history and is subjective and changes. And I don't really. Some people want to be convinced that a painting is great, but I'd rather convince them that people mattered in a way that we're not giving them credit for having mattered.
Yeah, the statistic, the second part of that sentence, just I'll read it out, that there are 1,300 women showing 7,000 works between 1760 and 1830. For comparison, you write, works by women were recently calculated to comprise less than 5% of the pieces currently on view in European and American museums. So that's totally counterintuitive. And it does, because we're thinking more women artists, contemporary art, massive increase in the display of contemporary art. So there are lots of factors that just would make you wonder how could that be. So I've asked you this before, but I'll ask you it again, which is one of the surprises of the book, I think, historically, is not only the numbers, the richness of the archive, the fact that you could do amazing exhibitions of all this material that you've shown, but also that the kind of fall into a male-dominated genius kind of art is much, much, much later than I, at least, had ever thought of it. The story is always the Renaissance comes along, the Middle Ages, people are doing crafts, and there are artists, and then the Renaissance comes along, and then things get more liberal as time passes. But in fact, there's suddenly this shutdown. And I wonder where you, if you had to, I know you're writing in another book, which we can talk a little bit about, but where would you date it? Is it actually modernism? Is it Picasso? When is the moment in which all of a sudden tradition is sort of replaced by something else, and all of a sudden you have 5%, I mean, I'm sure that, 20 years ago, it would have been like 1%.
Yeah.
So, when was the fall?
I think the fall was in the late 19th century,
Mhm.
and I think paradoxically and counterintuitively, it happened when women started to be admitted into the art schools from which they'd always been excluded. Because I think when that happened, all of a sudden that became a marker of merit for women that they'd never had before. And that created this new professional amateur divide, even among women exhibitors. Because a big part of the argument in my book is that if women exhibited and they listed their dress in the catalog, they had professional intent, even if we never know if they sold the work. This is them trying to sell their work, and that matters. And there's other women who didn't exhibit, didn't list their dresses, and they were amateurs, which is what we generally thought all women were in this period. And so I think once they were admitted to the schools, which also accompanied these huge and really horrible debates about genius, and really claiming women didn't have any, and that also accompanied the suffrage movement, all of these things. That's when these new categories solidified, and since women who were admitted to the schools now were the ones who were the professionals, everyone who came before became an amateur and wasn't really part of these narratives in the same way. And it was also the time when kind of new scientific history was starting to be written in Germany and then in France. And whereas there had been these kind of biographical histories before and these handbooks and manuals of artists that included, dozens if not hundreds of women every time they were published, all of a sudden you have this focus on the individual artist, the romantic artist, the male genius, that even within that you can see women slowly going out. Early editions of some books, let's say like Leon Rosenthal's Romanticism, his first one included this woman who's in my book, Constance Meyer, as an imitator of her teacher Proudhon. And then in his later book, he doesn't even include Meyer when he discusses Proudhon. So you kind of gradually see them go from being a focus to being a footnote to not being present at all, and to the point where there are these 3 art history books that still kind of dominate, that are still the dominant textbooks, let's say, which is Gardner's history, Jansen's history, and Gombrich. And Gardner's actually a woman who started writing in the 1920s, and Jansen and Gombrich were both 1950s, I think, and none of them had a woman by the 1950s. And that's then when second wave feminism began to enter and started bringing them back.
And do you think that the kind of demand that the great art is going to be anti-art from Manet on plays a role? That is, the rules suddenly shift. Suddenly, you're not allowed. You have to be able to play with the rules and destroy them in order to be the artist.
Yeah, and that the women are allowed into the academy right when it's losing prestige. It doesn't really matter anymore.
So I have the pleasure. This will be my last question, which is that I know that you're involved in a bigger picture. It's sort of like watching. I don't know. I saw the many Harry Potter books back there, and this story has a wonderful set of stories, and you're a very, very good storyteller. You're now writing a bigger picture of the story of art, and I wonder where will this. I won't ask you to tell us about that wonderful project, but just how would you retell this story in a story of art that goes back to cave painting? What does this episode look like now to you?
Yeah.
From 30,000 feet?
Yeah. That's a great question, and something I've been actually thinking about lately as I decide which part to write next of the new book. And part of me thinks I should write this part because I know it so well.
Right.
But I'm not going to because I want to write it chronologically and I want to actually fit into what's going before and after rather than stand out as this section with a very different sort of detail than the others might have. And the way that this is going to fit in is in a discussion of what's happening to art in the Age of Revolutions, which is neoclassicism emerges and goes away, romanticism replaces it. There's this new emphasis on facial features, on phonology, on the artist as a self that has evolved from the Renaissance self in really interesting ways. And the major trends of that time can be told through women. And that's where they'll be. And so I think it won't diverge strongly from this book, but it'll talk much more about the ways in which the trends we've always thought about rather than the specifics of history painting versus portraiture and all of the things women were doing. The way the bigger trends and the ways we understand this period are not gendered, but have been lost. And I don't spend a lot of time in this book talking about, I mention them, but I don't dwell on them, the fact that tons of the works in here were once attributed to men. And most of those misattributions happened, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, in the 20th century. And a lot of these works were bought by museums like the Frick and the Met and the Fog, Harvard Art Museum now, as works by mainly David, but also Boudon, a lot of other artists. And that's, I think, a huge part of this story, in fact, is why this book had to be written. And it's because this period was right before that historical writing period I was talking about.
Right. History of art as a discipline.
Exactly. And the art market, with the Impressionists becoming this completely different beast.
Right.
And that's when a lot of these paintings get lost. And so, recovering, not in the recovery mission sort of way, because that's important, but not what this project is, just what are the forces, intellectual and market and otherwise, that allowed these women to completely leave the picture, and why was that the case, and how can we be more tuned to those forces in our own world? And this period is the best example I know of that.
So I'll turn it over to the group, but just one last sort of thought on that is that it's great to see how this would fit into a bigger picture, but actually this is already such a big picture that one can imagine, generation of art historians coming in and developing bits and pieces. For example, I was amazed by the spin that some of these artists in Britain did on British history. So Fairy Queen, Spencer, where there's quite a rich repertoire of female characters, and you have also a particularity of British history with the British Queen, and so all of a sudden you say, well, any of these paintings, a whole dissertation could be written, and you were able to kind of both detail it, but control the material, and also to create a bigger picture, and even a bigger one in the prequel and sequel to come. So I'm gonna now, I think we should look, I'm looking at the clock, maybe we have time for questions from the audience.
Hi. I'm not a historian or an art historian, but I was just looking at some of the pictures you were showing us. Were these women primarily wealthy? Did they come from privileged backgrounds, and how did that fit into the discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. They weren't primarily wealthy. Women who were primarily wealthy weren't the ones who were trying to sell their art, and that's a really important distinction, because people mainly assume that, of course, they were wealthy and they had access to these materials and the time. There's one woman I know whose parents were servants, but for the most part, middle-class women from middle-class families, from artist families, which were generally middle-class, whose parents, in fact, wanted them to learn art to have something to fall back on. And there are letters and diaries that I found in both nations where that's explicitly stated. David gets in trouble for having women in his studio, and the parents of one of the artists write to the French state saying, you know, this is great for my family, there's no propriety here, and it's giving my daughters a skill if anything should happen to them. There's a woman in England who writes this incredible diary that survives. It's 100 manuscript pages, and she both says that she started painting, her husband was an artist, when she saw what happened with the French Revolutionary Wars, and all these people lost their fortunes, and so she wanted to have something to fall back on. And then she trained her daughter, and then was really glad when her daughter explicitly decided for it to be a profession, because then her daughter would have something to provide for herself. There are some women who stop exhibiting when they get married and start again when they have kids because they need help with family finances. There's in England, one of the things about Auckland is that she says that most women who became artists had to come from artist families, were either the daughters or wives of artists. And in England, that's certainly true, but it's this commercial and professional model. It's not a domestic one. And so you have these women, these sisters who are going and painting, and you know, there's another diary that records them saying like, picture painted one day, sold the next, and money spent the third. It's and so people are really doing it, you know, for a day-to-day mode of living. Rather, there are a lot of wealthy women who are also painting and drawing and doing all these other forms of art that are incredible, but those aren't the ones that I'm studying. Yeah.
Congratulations on this. It's splendid. I want to ask about form and size. So you talk about sort of the enormous history paintings and so on. And painting is in basically the title of the book, canvas. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, and a lot of what you've shown us on the PowerPoint is painting as well, whether you see there being a gender dynamic to the choice of medium, to the scale that's available, or did that just happen to be because that's what was being exhibited and where you found the evidence?
That's a great question. What I found in terms of what women were exhibiting, and so for a work to be exhibited, it went to an all-male jury, it had to be accepted and chosen for display. And we don't have all the records, for England, but we do have a lot of them for France. And they show that women are actually being rejected in higher numbers as the period goes on, but they're also exhibiting higher numbers. And so that means that they're, you know, submitting art in exponentially growing numbers, and that given the chance to keep their art off the walls, men aren't choosing to do that. They're actually choosing to include it on display. And one of the most interesting things is that in both Britain and France, what women are exhibiting is roughly proportional, smaller number, but proportionally similar to what men are exhibiting in terms of the different genres. And that I wasn't expecting at all. You know, still life and flower paintings, which we think is all that women did, is actually like, I think it's certainly less than 10%. I think it's less than 5% in France. I don't want to quote the wrong number, but, and so a lot of the works don't survive. I think I've tracked about 600 of the 7,000. And so it's a lot to have found, but there's a lot that has yet to be found too. And I really hope people, as Joseph was saying, take this on, study this, and find it, and you know, prove me wrong in a lot of areas. But until that happens, what we know is that they're generally making the choices that men are making, which are presumably the choices that they think will have their art accepted for display. And at least that's how I see that decision-making process. They know that the selection committee is likes a certain genre, a certain type, a certain, material, and that is being applied to women and men in the same way, and women seem to know to make those choices. And one question I get a lot in that realm is whether women are painting miniature portraits, not large portraits, and that makes it less commercial in some ways, or less of a feat in some way. It's something that has come up, and so then I actually went and looked at what we could find about which were miniatures and which weren't. And they are exhibiting increasing numbers of miniature portraits as the period goes on, but the number of non-miniature portraits also stays the same the whole time. And at first, it's mainly all full-scale portraits, and so there aren't really these genres that are female in that way. And of course, there were a ton of male miniaturists, and they saw it as a way to make a lot of money. And so, kind of this gendering of genres isn't something I found, but it may be in their narrative subject choices, but it's not even in their portrait subjects. Because there's also a chart that shows that, for single sitter portraits, portrait of a man, portrait of a woman, portrait, who are women depicting. I broke that down, and it's pretty even across genders. And so it was really hard to find an area where these were clearly kind of feminine choices being made.
There's a passage that's scrutinized in Lyndon Lockman where she talks about whether a feminist art history should look at femininity, say, in style. But there was one point, I know that there's another question, there was one point where I found that very fascinating, that when women were finding making these giant history paintings, as was everybody, they had a tendency they had an interest in creating perspectives and also choosing stories in which women played a role, which meant that some people didn't know the story, because it was Penelope scratching her foot while Telemachus, meanwhile, is consulting the library. And then people said, I don't know that part of the story. So the problem that then arises that history, as it's written, is of course around events and generals killing people. So it's in order to find the female perspective, it doesn't have to be a female perspective per se, but it has to be a slightly oblique telling of a story, which in these history paintings generally no one knows what the stories are, let alone all these Greek heroes and Roman generals. And if you see it from a different side, there's one person who says, what, like, the point of
History that is so obscure.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's an Angelica Kaufman one.
Right, that's
Yeah.
right, that's right.
Yeah.
I think you have a question, and then over there. Yeah.
Thanks. This is a really exciting conversation. I want to ask about some different women's choices, and that's wealthy women patrons. I mean, one of the interesting things that it's counterintuitive. You'd think perhaps that women might buy women's work and preserve it that way and help a tradition. That doesn't seem to have happened. I was just curious to hear you speak about that.
Yeah, so thank you. There are a lot of wealthy women patrons who are part of this. Josephine's buying works, Queen Charlotte's buying works, Napoleon's sisters are buying works. Marie Antoinette is a huge patron and supporter of women, which isn't usually part of the narrative about her. But again, what surprised me was that Napoleon's also a huge patron. And, we think he hated women writers, he hated Joanne de Stael, but he seems to have been fine with women artists. And he actually created this prize system at the Salon, and the first year was 1804, and one first prize was given for all the paintings at the French Salon, and it was given actually to a woman. And so the Napoleonic state raised women's potential in a huge way and really rewarded them for publicly exhibiting their work. And there are women patrons throughout this. And I didn't focus on them as much as I could have, and I think I'd really like to, at some point, go back to the archive with that in mind. But I guess what interested me is, while they're certainly there, and I certainly expected to find them there, they weren't the only ones there by any means, and that wasn't what I expected at all. Although there is this one woman, Emma Lamb, who had, Caroline Lamb, who had this affair and ended up choosing several different women artists to paint her different versions of the affair, with one with Byron, one with someone else. And I think that there was an aspect of a woman trusting a woman to do this job.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. And as many have said, this is really a tour de force, and it gives us a lot of power in forming Silverby in the future. I have a question about a different feminine representation. I haven't read the book, so I'm sorry if it's inside. I just opened it and found this beautiful scene with the missionaries and the Eskimos. And I was wondering if, while writing this book, or like proceeding with your research, if you found already, or if you have some paths that can be taken with more intersectional perspectives that look at women as the centered subjects also, like we have non-white women, non-Western. So if there is a fruitful way to consider that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. There definitely is, and that is one of the parts of the book that I tried to include it as much as I could based on what I found that was exhibited. But there's a lot more there, and I would like, my own time to go more into it. And again, a lot of the paintings don't survive, or we know that Angelica Kaufman also did a painting of what was called at the time Eskimo Mother and Man, and it's an incredible painting actually, and partly wanted to put it in the book for the sake of being able to talk about it, and it wasn't exhibited, and it didn't feel like the right reason to include it. It didn't feel as respectful ultimately to do it that way. But we do have women painting non-white subjects, and I think that's and we have men painting non-white subjects too, and I think as we are emphasizing the ways in which we can find men doing it, it's really important for us to start emphasizing the ways women did it too, and to talk about the intersectionalities, and to talk about what these relationships were. There's the very famous painting by Benoit in the Louvre, which is literally called Portrait of a Black Woman, and that's in here, and there's a lot of research that's been done on that piece. That's really interesting because she was probably a former slave in her sister's house, and it's read in all these different ways, and people have tried to do a lot more research into who the sitter was and how much agency she even had in sitting for the painting. And it's a very important part of the story also because she probably didn't have very much, and yet it's this, widely celebrated painting. It was in the Beyonce video. Actually the one painting by a woman and the one painting they didn't pose in front of, so I always wondered if they heard about it later on and then put it at the end. But I think one of the most important aspects of London at this time is it was the most international city in the world. And so for the history of art to be a white one wouldn't be historically responsible either.
Any further questions?
One quick one.
Yeah.
Were women using men's names or not using their first name, just initials, to obscure who they were?
That's a great question. I haven't found any instances of women who are posing as men when they exhibit the ways that they do it when writing. There's no George Eliot's.
That was my
Well, thank you so much for your questions, and thank you so much for